Alright, hi everyone. I hope you guys are having a great day. So we have a lot going on this week. First of all, we do have an activity that's going to be due by Friday at 5 p.m., so make sure that you complete the activity. Also, Exam 2 is going to be available this week. So it's going to be released at 12 p.m., that's noon, on March 7th, and will be available until 12 p.m. or noon on March 14th. So make sure that you take the exam during the time that it's available. It'll be just like the first exam. It'll be 50 questions, multiple choice, true, false matching. Also, the last 2 multiple choice questions will be opinion questions, and I have talked to the people from Canvas and figured out the best way to take care of the opinion questions, so that should go a little bit more smoothly this time. If you have any questions as you start to prepare for the exam, let me know. The study guide is posted, and also in addition to the lecture video this week, I will also be posting a review video. So watch the lecture for this week, do the activity, and then also watch the review video, look at the study guide, take the practice test, and then when you're ready, take Exam 2. Make sure to take it before the deadline. And if you have any questions as you're preparing for that, please let me know. So last week we talked about attitudes, and so we said that an attitude is our evaluation of something. Today we're going to talk about persuasion, which is really focused on ways that we can try to change people's attitudes. We're also going to spend some time today talking about ways to resist persuasion. So if you feel strongly about something and you don't want someone to persuade you, how you can be prepared to avoid that. Okay? So let's go ahead and get into lecture for today. Alright, so last week we started talking about attitudes, and we said that an attitude is just our evaluation of something, whether it be a positive attitude or a negative attitude. It is the way that we view a person or a situation or a thing, right? And we talked about attitudes having several different components, about affective, behavioral, and cognitive attitudes. This week we're going to talk about persuasion, and you'll see that we have to understand what our attitudes are before we can talk about persuasion, because persuasion is all about attempting to change people's attitudes. So persuasive communication is communication advocating a particular side of an issue. So a couple of examples that come to mind, first of all, perhaps politics. We had an activity last week where I asked you guys to weigh in on your thoughts about politics, where they came from, and whether or not they could be persuaded. That's a very hot button topic right now with the presidential debates going on and us gearing up for election season. Well, there are people who get paid lots and lots of money to persuade you, right? Candidates pay their staff a lot of money to come up with arguments that will change people's attitudes in a certain direction, right? Another example of persuasive communication will be television ads, which we're going to talk more about later in this lecture, and we will actually have an activity about this week. But when you see a commercial, they're trying to get you to buy something, right? Whether that be because they're trying to make you feel good about their product, or they're trying to convince you that their product is something that you just have to have that will make your life easier or better. The idea is that they are trying to persuade you to see things the way they want you to, right? So the question is, how should you construct a message so that it will really change people's attitudes? If you're the person that's in charge of, say, for example, writing a speech for a political candidate or coming up with a commercial to sell a product, you have to think about how it is that you can construct that message so that it will be effective. So today we're going to talk about a few things that influence whether or not we are persuaded. One of the most important things is personal relevance of the topic. How important is the topic to the individual's well-being, right? So you're more likely to pay attention if you feel like this issue is relevant to you, right? More personally relevant, you're more likely to pay attention, right? And this is the central route for persuasion. Now, when you see central route here, all this means is that the main way or the central way that people are persuaded is through paying attention to the particular argument. So if you are very invested in this particular topic, then you're more likely to pay close attention to what people have to say, and you'll pay attention to the quality of the argument. So the central route or the main way of persuading people is by providing them with a compelling argument. You will see, though, that if it's less personally relevant, there are other things that people do to persuade you. But sticking with this topic right now, for example, a lot of you guys are not very concerned about Social Security and retirement, right? So if you heard a particular political candidate talking about that, that doesn't really influence you. But if you were older and if this was something that you depended on and was very important to you, you would pay much more attention to those arguments, right? I have children who are school-aged, and so I pay really close attention to what people have to say about education because that's very personally relevant to me. But if you didn't have a child who was school-aged, then those particular things wouldn't be as important to you, right? So the idea is that if you're trying to persuade someone, you need to convince them that it's personally relevant to them. That's a way to get people to pay attention to your argument, whatever the argument may be, right? So one of the things that influences whether or not people are paying attention to the argument is a need for cognition. It says this is a personality variable reflecting the extent to which people engage in and enjoy effortful cognitive activities. So the idea here is that some people just enjoy cognitive activity, thinking critically about things, right? Some people enjoy spending their free time maybe listening to these debates and the arguments and doing their own research, right? People who are high in the need for cognition, in other words, people who enjoy thinking critically about things, are more likely to form their attitudes through that central route. In other words, if it's especially important to them to have that cognitive connection, that cognitive action, to be studying the thing for themselves and looking into things themselves, they will form their attitudes through the central route through paying attention to the argument, right? However, people who are low in the need for cognition, so people who don't necessarily enjoy thinking critically about something or putting a lot of effort into working something out for themselves, they may not depend on that central route, or in other words, they may not pay attention to the actual argument. They may pay more attention to peripheral cues, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So this is just a personality variable that differs from person to person. So you need to know that it's important to know your audience in order to be able to persuade them. So, it says when people are unable to pay close attention to the arguments, then they're not necessarily going to be persuaded through the central route. The central route is paying attention to the arguments. So if people are unable or unwilling to pay attention to the arguments, then they're more likely to be swayed by peripheral cues here. Like, for example, the status of the person or whether you like or trust that person. So, when we're talking about politicians, perhaps it's just a convenient example. If you have someone who is very much invested in this, has a high need for cognition, then they'll want to pay attention to the specific plans the person has, listening to their policies, for example, and doing their research. If you have someone who is low in the need for cognition or someone who doesn't enjoy doing that research, that person is more likely to be swayed by, for example, whether they get a good feeling about the candidate, whether they like the person, is the person attractive, right? Does this person bring out some kind of reaction in myself? Do they look like they trust them? Does the person have a strong persona? Do they seem like they are a strong person? That's something that you're getting by looking at the person, not necessarily by something that you're getting by listening to what they have to say, right? When we're talking about television ads as another easy example of persuasion, sometimes they use celebrities to sell you something, right? And so when I teach this class in person, I ask students, what's a celebrity that you would listen to? Like if this celebrity was endorsing a product, you trust that celebrity. You feel like if they are telling you it's a good product, then you can buy the product. It's a good product. On the other hand, maybe there are some celebrities that we look at and say, okay, that endorsement was not a good one. I have no interest in this person, so I'm actually less likely to buy the product. That's just the status of the person trying to sell you something or whether or not you like them, right? Someone with a weak argument can still be persuasive if they distract their audience. So sometimes the person that you're listening to, whether this be a politician or be a television commercial or any other person trying to persuade you, sometimes they don't actually have a very good argument, but they can still be persuasive if, for example, they distract you with something about their status or something about you can trust me, and they try to make a connection with you, right? They can still persuade people, right? This is like salesmen that sell people things that they don't really want, right? Why? Because they were very persuasive, and so salesmen make a lot of money off of this. And so it depends on the kind of person you are as to what it is that you pay attention to and how easily you are persuaded. Okay? So people who base their attitudes on a careful analysis of the argument, so these are people who are persuaded through the central route, are more likely to maintain this attitude, more likely to behave consistently with the attitude, and more resistant to counter-persuasion. Now, you can see why this might be. If the attitude that you have was formed based on careful research and critical thinking, then you're likely to feel like you know a lot about the topic and you have carefully thought out your decision. So you'll be more likely to keep that decision, you're not going to let people persuade you, and you'll be more likely to act consistently with this. If your attitude was based on maybe whether you like the person selling the product or you just have a good feeling about the candidate, rather than based on careful research, then you will be more likely to be persuaded and to change your mind. Okay? So we are talking about persuasion, and one of the ways that people persuade people would be using emotion. And you see this with candidates, you see this with commercials, with any kind of persuasion. Using emotion, whether it be good or bad, to get a point across. So one example of this that we see pretty frequently are fear-arousing communications. Persuasive messages that attempt to change people's attitudes by arousing their fears. There are a lot of possible examples of this. The idea is that fear is an emotion that can perhaps drive us to make changes if we see something that makes us afraid. Like, one example could be a commercial that talks about texting while driving. And so you see these commercials where they say this was the text message that the person sent before they killed someone or before they died themselves, or this was the picture of the gory car they were driving, something like that. Obviously, this is intended to produce fear that will hopefully lead to behavior change, right? Another example would be what you see, cigarettes, right? Many of you are probably not old enough to remember a time when they actually used to advertise cigarettes. They don't have commercials now promoting cigarettes anymore, but they do frequently have commercials talking about the dangers of using tobacco, right? And this is something that is intended to scare people who smoke into quitting smoking, or it's intended to get people who have not yet started smoking not to start smoking because it's trying to scare them, right? They're using a fear tactic here. The question is, are we actually persuaded by fear-arousing communication? Does this actually change, for example, smoking behaviors or texting while driving behaviors? Well, there are a couple of things you can do to make fear-arousing communication work. First of all, moderate amounts of fear work best, and we'll talk about why this is on the future slides, but it's important not to have a very small amount of fear or even a very extreme amount of fear. Somewhere in the middle seems to work best. Also, you need to provide information on how to reduce that fear. So, for example, giving people information about what they can do to make sure that they're not in a car accident, or what they can do to help them quit smoking, right? It's important to provide them that information. In addition to scaring them, you also have to give them some hope, right? Forgive me for quoting the Hunger Games here, but if you have, what does President Snow say, right? Fear never works if you have hope, right? Something like that. Forgive me for the reference. But the idea is that we give people hope in addition to the fear, right? So I have to have research to back up what I'm saying. So here you see a research study, and what they're trying to do here is to change people's behaviors with smoking. So there were 3 groups, right? One group was not given the film, the scary film, and was not given, or was given instructions on how to stop smoking or on what they can do. This group in the orange, they were given the film with the scary, this is what happens when you smoke, but they were not given instructions on how to quit smoking. And then finally, this group was shown a film that had scary information about smoking, but they were also given instructions, okay? So let's take a look at what happened. So the green line got no fear. They just got instructions on how to quit smoking. Well, this was basically our control group, and you can see they kept smoking, right? There was no real behavior change here. The orange group is the group that was shown the film, so they got the fear, but they did not get instructions on how to reduce their smoking or how to prevent the feared outcome from happening. They dropped off a little bit, but not a whole lot, okay? But finally, the group that did the best was the group that received the film, so they had fear, they were shown something scary, but they also were given instructions on how to prevent the feared outcome from happening. And so what we see is that we need to have some fear, but we also need to give them hope about a way to prevent the feared outcome from happening. Okay? So we understand why we can't have very low amounts of fear, right? Because it takes us at least some fear to have behavior change. If there was no fear at all, there would be no behavior change. However, why is it that we don't use strong amounts of fear? Why is it that we don't go for totally freaking people out? Well, strong amounts of fear often fail because, first of all, people become defensive. Talk about the cognitive dissonance here. People don't want to believe that it can happen to them. And if it's a really, really terrible outcome, people will become very defensive about that very quickly and may deny the importance of the threat. So remember when we talked about cognitive dissonance, we said we can either change the behavior or change the belief or add a justification. One thing they may do here is instead of changing their behavior and stop smoking or stop texting while driving, they'll change their belief that there's something wrong with smoking or with texting while driving, right? And so I'm just using these examples because they were ones that came with the book, but they fit pretty well. People will deny the importance of the threat, and they may not be able to think rationally about an issue. If people get very emotional because of large amounts of fear, they may not be able to think rationally, right? They will probably change the channel. I mean, what happens if you see a commercial like this that is very disturbing? You change the channel. You don't even watch the commercial, right? So if the fear is too much, people may not even watch it. So you have to be careful, keep a moderate amount of fear. So we're talking about advertising as an example of persuasion, but does advertising even work? If you ask people, they often feel like they are not influenced by advertising. However, research suggests that we are pretty influenced by advertising. One example here, it says until the early 20th century, men bought 99% of cigarettes, so women were just not buying them. But then advertisers began targeting women. And so what they said was, first of all, it's women's lib, right? Women's liberation. If a man can do it, a woman can do it, you should be able to smoke too. They also said, hey, this will help you lose weight. And hey, this will make you glamorous, right? Once again, thinking about how they are making it personally relevant to the individuals that they're trying to sell their product to. And it actually worked. Smoking in females shot up substantially. And today, not today, but in the most recent numbers that I have here, it looks like there's, roughly equal numbers of men and women smoking. And so advertising is very, very powerful. People are more influenced by advertising than they think, right? Particularly for new products, we see that when they put out a commercial for something, usually the sales go up pretty substantially. Think about the amount of money that people spend on commercials. I don't know if you guys watch the Super Bowl. Some people, I'm a fan of football, so I watch for the football, but some people watch just for the commercials. What is it about Super Bowl commercials that we like? Well, people spend so much money because there are so many people watching. So they usually really, they up the ante here. They put out their best commercial they can think of, whether it be something that's funny or something that grabs your attention, something that's new or different. People spend lots and lots of money on coming up with these great commercials and showing them on television. I guarantee you that people would not be spending millions of dollars for a 30-second commercial if they didn't have some research to suggest that this actually was they were going to get their money back here, that this was going to be effective. So another example of advertising here, and this is probably not something you would see done today, although maybe people still try to make it personally relevant. This says, often a bridesmaid, never a bride, and it's actually an ad for Listerine, trying to suggest, I suppose, that women were not finding a husband because they had bad breath, perhaps. You can see, as it says today, this seems offensive, but in the 1930s, it was making a connection here between an issue that was relevant to them and a product they were trying to sell. But think about how we do this today. We might not necessarily do it this way, but there are lots of ways that we try to make advertising relevant today, right? We'll talk about more commercials when we actually look at the activity. One thing I said, though, we know that advertising works, right? Advertising in general works. However, subliminal messages usually do not. Subliminal messages, words or pictures that are not consciously perceived, but may nevertheless influence people's judgments, attitudes, and behavior. The idea behind a subliminal message is that they're trying to sneak in some kind of message that you're not aware of, but most research doesn't find any strong evidence to support this. One example is, like, they say they're trying to sneak in some kind of subtle clues about buying things at the concession stand into movies and the movie theater so that they can make money. That actually the majority of the money that movie theaters make is not off of movie tickets but off of snacks, right? And so there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that. I don't know if you guys watched Friends, the television show. There was an episode where I think Chandler was trying to quit smoking, and so he was listening to this tape, this like quit smoking tape while he was asleep to try to change his beliefs or whatever, and Joey snuck in and re-recorded it like, you will make your friend a sandwich and everything. Trying to do subliminal messaging here, but there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that that kind of thing actually works. So advertising in general works, subliminal messaging usually not. This is a picture that came with the book. It says sometimes people try to implant sexual images in advertising. It says people have been trying to find the breasts in these ice cubes since 1957. I still have no idea what this picture is talking about, right? I haven't seen it yet. But sometimes people do try to implant sexual images. I remember seeing an episode of Pawn Stars where, I can't remember what brand it was. It was Pepsi or Dr. Pepper or something like that. People brought in like vintage cans, and if you stacked up this particular series of cans and turned it in a certain way, the pattern on the cans like spelled out the word sex, and they were talking about subliminal messaging. So while advertising in general does work, subliminal messaging usually not very effective. So how is it that we make our commercials effective then? Not by subliminal messaging or by trying to sneak in a message. How do we do it? Well, it says advertisers and retailers want to create good feelings about their product, right? That's the whole idea. Whether they make you feel like it's cool, or it makes you seem like you fit in, or it makes you seem different from everyone else, whatever the case may be, they want to give you good feelings about their product. So they're going to pair their product with appealing music or pleasant images, hoping that people will attribute the feelings to the product, right? So I think we talked a little bit about classical conditioning briefly, but just the idea that people learn associations. Maybe you watch a commercial, you hear a song for the first time, and you think, wow, that's a really cool song, I really like that song, and then every time you hear the song, you think about the product. You've learned an association here. The song made you feel empowered in some way, and you translate that feeling to the product. Also, there are other kinds of feelings they're trying to associate here. Have you ever noticed the amount of bikinis in beer commercials? Think about when they're trying to sell something to primarily a male audience. They often use a lot of scantily clad women. Why would they do that? Well, it's the idea that seeing people in various states of undress causes a response, right? A natural response. That they're then hoping that you will associate with their product so that you'll feel really good about whatever it is they're trying to sell you as well. It's all about persuading people. And so maybe after today's lecture, you'll pay more attention to commercials and you'll see how they're trying to influence you. So, how are we going to change attitudes? Persuasion is all about changing attitudes. And last lecture we talked about the difference between cognitive and affective, and we also talked about behavioral attitudes as well, but a lot of times when we think about attitudes, cognitive and affective are some of the most common ones. It says that several studies have shown that it's best to fight fire with fire. If an attitude is cognitively based, try to change it with rational arguments. So we said that a cognitive attitude is one that is built on logical thinking. And if your feelings about something or your attitude is caused by logical thinking or looking into the facts, then the best way to persuade you is to show you different facts, right? So then cognitively based attitudes are easily changed or most easily changed through rational arguments. On the other hand, an affectively based or emotionally based attitude is going to be changed through emotional appeals, right? So think about commercials. Think about Sarah McLachlan singing the song with the puppies in the background, right? That is trying to pull at your heartstrings, right? It's affectively based. And so if we have these affective attitudes, then people try to change them with emotional appeals. So they think about the kind of individual who's going to be watching this commercial, who's going to be perhaps experiencing whatever persuasion they're trying to put across. And sometimes you can't have both. So some commercials are trying to pull at your heartstrings while also persuading your mind, right? And maybe the best commercials do some of both. So activity 6 this week is going to be about persuasion in commercials. So I want to make sure that this activity makes sense. So when you log into Canvas and you pull up the activity, what you're going to see is you're going to see links to 6 commercials. There are 3 pairs. So the first pair is going to be 2 different commercials related to diapers. The next pair, I think, is the commercials related to fast food restaurants or fast food chains. And the third pair of commercials is one of each for 2 different sporting goods companies. So what I want you to do is watch the 2 diaper commercials and then pick one of the 2 and tell me which one was most persuasive and why. Then you'll watch the 2 fast food commercials and you'll see which one you think is most persuasive and tell me why. And then finally you'll see the 2 commercials for the sporting goods. Pick one of those and tell me which one is most persuasive and why. So you'll end up choosing 3 commercials and describe them to me. Tell me perhaps maybe how they use celebrities, or how they use music, or how they used affective, emotional pleas versus maybe cognitive statistics, or trying to logically, rationally explain something to you, right? So I want you to watch these commercials and talk about how they are trying to persuade you, okay? And if you have any questions about this, let me know. These are just the links here, and those are already posted for you on Canvas, okay? So that's going to be due by Friday at 5 p.m. All right, emotion and different types of attitudes. We know that sometimes when they're trying to persuade you, especially if it's an affective attitude, they can use a more emotional kind of plea. It says sometimes the ads stress the objective merits, a more cognitive kind of approach. Like, for example, this is a great price. They'll show you, like, look at what this would cost at a different cell phone company versus what it costs at our cell phone company, right? Or reliability, where they say we have the best network, look at how many towers we have, we never drop calls, or whatever. Or efficiency, right? This is how many miles to the gallon that you can get when you're driving our kind of vehicle. The idea here is to make a logical connection. Other ads stress emotions and values, right? So, for example, sex, when they are using maybe scantily clad individuals to try to sell you something. Or they say, this will make you feel beautiful, this will make you be beautiful, this will keep you young, right? This is proven to help you find a life mate or something like that, right? Sometimes they try to get at our brain, and sometimes they try to get at our heart. The question is, which kind of ad is most effective? And the answer here is that it probably varies. One person might respond more to the cognitive type. One person might respond more to the more emotional type. So it just varies. Now, one thing, as I said, you need to know your audience when you're coming up with these ads or any kind of persuasive communication. And we've already talked a little bit about the kind of culture that we live in. That we live in an individualistic society. When you live in an individualistic society, we tend to base our attitudes more on individuality and self-improvement. We tend to think a lot about ourselves. So then, if you're trying to sell something to an individual in our culture, then perhaps you want to play up this will make you better than everyone else. This will make you cooler. This will make you stand out. So maybe if you're trying to sell a certain kind of athletic shoe, you say, well, this will make you the MVP. This will make you score the most points. This will make you the star. On the other hand, Eastern cultures base attitudes more on the standing within a social group. So this kind of shoe will help you fit in. Or perhaps this kind of shoe will help your team win championships. You see that there's an emphasis on whether you're trying to help yourself versus help other people. Or whether you're trying to stand out versus fit in. So once again, just knowing your audience, if you see commercials in different countries, they're probably going to frame things in very different ways. Okay. So now that we've talked about persuasion, how are we going to resist persuasion? Because sometimes we don't want to be persuaded. Sometimes people try to persuade us into doing things we shouldn't be doing. And sometimes we feel very strongly about our beliefs on something and we do not want to be persuaded. Or sometimes we are parents and we're trying to prepare our children not to be persuaded. Attitude inoculation. What is an inoculation? Well, an inoculation is like a vaccine, right? And what's the purpose of a vaccine? Well, the idea behind a vaccine is that you give someone a weakened, deadened version of an illness, and that allows their body to build up immunity to it, right? So you give them a very tiny form of something, and it lets them be prepared if they are confronted with the full version. So attitude inoculation is doing the same thing with attitudes, making people immune to attempts to change their attitudes by exposing them to small doses of the arguments against their position. So I don't know if your parents did this with you or not, or if anyone did this, maybe your teachers or someone at school did this with you, but it's the idea that you have to be prepared, right? So it's like, what are you going to say? You're at a party and somebody offers you drugs. What are you going to do? Right? Having them be prepared. And so, well, what if they say, this will make you cool, and you have an answer, right? I know it sounds kind of lame, but the idea is that if people are not prepared to resist persuasion, then when they get put into a situation where people are being very persuasive, they may not know what to do. So attitude inoculation is just helping people be prepared by having them come up with an argument that keeps them comfortable with what happens, right? So something that they can say. When someone says, come on, you should do this with us, you should drink this or do this, then you need to be prepared with something to help the person understand that you're not going to go along with what they're saying. So one kind of persuasive message that you might want to resist is people trying to sell you something that you don't want to buy, right? Advertisers increasingly place messages about their products in shows. Maybe you can think of some examples of this where a certain television show seems to always be showing a product. I don't watch American Idol. I watched like one season a while back, but I know that the judges on American Idol always have like Coke cups in front of them, and maybe every single judge that has ever been on that show, and I have no idea how many judges they've had, maybe every single one of them loved Coke, but it seems more likely that perhaps they were just getting paid to put that out there and advertise for Coke. You see that sometimes certain television shows or certain movies have the same product over and over again, right? So they pay the makers of the television show or the movie to put those products into the script. Like, for example, this scene from, I'm not sure if this is a movie or a television show, so some picture that came with the book, right? But it says product placement is incorporated into a lot of different things. So here, you're just watching a movie or a television show, but perhaps they're advertising their particular brand of laptop, for example. This happens all the time, and we might not even realize that it's happening. We should realize it, though. It says when people are forewarned, they analyze what they see and hear more carefully and are more likely to avoid attitude change. So, if they told people ahead of time, you're going to be shown this movie, and in this movie you're going to see a lot of advertisements for this product because they got paid to include them. People said, okay, so when they saw those things that were put in there, they weren't actually very persuaded by them. However, if people are not warned, then they can be persuaded. They are more likely to go out and buy that product. So, one way to resist persuasive messages is just to be aware that people are trying to persuade you and to look for things that you can say, okay, this is just an attempt to persuade me. So, before we send kids to the movies or let them watch TV, we need to remind them that they are likely to encounter attempts to change their attitudes. So, there are all kinds of things that kids are being exposed to today, right, on television and in movies. And so you need to make sure that they're prepared for these things that they see, right? My husband kind of jokingly has called this the One Tree Hill mentality of, we're supposed to get married in high school and we're supposed to all be professional basketball players and somebody's going to shoot our uncle. And, anyway, I don't know if you guys have seen that television show, but it makes life seem much more dramatic. Having kids be prepared for what is reality is important, right? That you're going to go and you're going to see these things glorified, maybe drug use and alcohol use and all these things are going to be glorified, but you need to know the truth about them. If we prepare kids for this before they are exposed to these things, they'll be much more likely to be able to resist them, right? FYI, I thought One Tree Hill was pretty good. Anyway. anyway, okay, so resisting peer pressure. Peer pressure is an attempt to persuade using affective arguments, right? It says peer pressure does not operate on logical arguments, right? It operates on values and emotions. So it's not the idea that there is like something that's a good idea about going along with what the other kids are doing or wearing what they're wearing or whatever the case may be. It's not about a logical argument. It's about that affective, I want to have friends. I want to be part of the group. I want people to like me. So peer pressure is usually affectively based. So that means to help prepare our children to avoid peer pressure, or even ourselves, because it's not like peer pressure stops when we get out of high school. To help us be prepared for this, we have to have attitude inoculation. So practicing defending our point of view by focusing on emotional appeals. Knowing that people will try to change our attitudes by playing to our emotions, we need to be prepared for that and practice that. That will help us be able to resist peer pressure. So peer pressure is a type of persuasion that often works on that like emotional, affective attitude. So be prepared to help avoid that, right? So the child then is prepared for when their friends say, but this will make you cool, or you can hang out with us if we do this, but you can't hang out with us if you don't do that. It's really an emotional situation rather than a cognitive one, so they need to be prepared to make that kind of argument. Okay? And then one of the last things we're going to talk about here, when we're talking about persuasion, sometimes persuasion fails. Reactance theory, the idea that when people feel their freedom to perform a certain behavior is threatened, an unpleasant state of reactance is aroused, which can be reduced by performing the threatened behavior. All this is saying is that sometimes we try to persuade someone not to do something, we actually make them want to do it more. So one example here is when we're trying to get people not to graffiti on things. There was one research study where they posted a sign on one wall saying, please do not spray paint on this wall. And on the other wall, they wrote, you are absolutely forbidden from spray painting on this wall. As you might expect, the people who put, please don't spray paint, that wall didn't get spray painted on very much. But when they put, you absolutely are not allowed, everybody spray painted on it. Why? They didn't like being told what they couldn't do. That was not persuasive to them. It didn't change their attitude about it, right? So sometimes when people feel like someone is preventing them or telling them they can't do something, it makes them want to do it more. And this is why I'm terrified of parenting adolescents, right? My kids right now are 5 and 3, but I can see that the teenage years are going to be here probably before I'm ready for them. But think about what it's like to parent a teenager when you're trying to tell them you cannot do this because we're trying to protect them from something, but it could end up backfiring on us. Think about that Romeo and Juliet situation where we say you absolutely cannot date this person. Sometimes that makes them just like that person more. But spoiler alert, in case you're not aware, Romeo and Juliet didn't really work out well for anyone. So just something to keep in mind. And the last thing we're going to talk about is how well do our attitudes predict our behaviors. Attitude accessibility is basically just the idea of how strongly we hold an attitude. The strength of the association between an attitude object and the person's evaluation of that object. So how strong is your evaluation of something? How strong is your attitude? Now, when we're talking about predicting spontaneous behaviors, only highly accessible attitudes will predict those behaviors. So a spontaneous behavior is one that we're not planning, right? It's something that we do spur of the moment. And hopefully we don't make huge decisions spontaneously, but sometimes we do. But often those spontaneous decisions are just little things, right? But if it's a very strongly held attitude, then even in a spontaneous spur-of-the-moment situation, it will still influence us. If this is an attitude that we hold very near and dear to our hearts, then even those decisions that we make in the spur-of-the-moment, those will still be impacted. However, if it's an attitude that we hold very weakly, it's not likely to influence our spontaneous behaviors because we might not think about it. It might not come to mind in the short period of time that we have to make this kind of decision. However, when we're talking about planned behavior, something that you put a lot of thought into, then everything plays a role. Your strongly held beliefs, the beliefs that you don't hold as strongly, the norms, or basically we'll talk about norms in the next section of the class, but the rules of your society, right? Perceived behavioral control. So how much power do you think you have to do whatever it is that you're wanting to do? So when we're talking about a big decision that is planned and deliberate, like for example, who you're going to marry, or where you're going to go to school, or what you want to do for a living, or any decision that is planned out ahead of time, all of these things will influence you. Whereas if we're talking about a spontaneous decision, then only very closely held attitudes will influence you. Okay? So that is the end of lecture for this week. So a few things to keep in mind. Okay? First of all, don't forget about the activity for this week. It's going to be due by Friday at 5 p.m. Also, now you have all the material that you need for the next exam, so make sure that you take the exam, take the practice exam, for extra credit, as well as to help you prepare. Also, I'm going to be posting a review video to kind of go over the study guide and talk about the most important points. So email me if you have any questions. Come by my office hours if you need any help. Don't forget about the activity or about the exam. Okay? Just let me know if you need anything, and I will talk to you guys next week.